A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. AITA for leaving the room after my BF surprised me. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Brad had been working tirelessly for months, and I thought he finally wanted to treat us to some much-needed relaxation at his family's cabin in the woods, just the two of us. I should have felt lucky, but as the sun dipped below the horizon on our first night, I sensed something was off. After a lovely dinner, Brad insisted we take a stroll outside to gaze at the stars, a romantic gesture, I thought, but when we reached the clearing, he pulled out a flashlight and shone it onto a crudely carved face on a tree. "Isn't that creepy?" He laughed, but I just felt a chill run down my spine. It looked like a distorted version of a human face, its mouth stretched wide in an unnatural grin. I jokingly told him it reminded me of a horror movie, but Brad's laughter faded into something more serious as he pointed out the countless other carvings littering the trees around us, each one more sinister than the last. It felt like we had stumbled into the hideout of a deranged artist. I suggested we head back, my instincts screaming at me that this was not just a scenic getaway but perhaps something else entirely, yet he insisted on taking a closer look, thrill-seeking gleaming in his eyes as he veered deeper into the woods, and I followed reluctantly, the growing darkness around us feeling more oppressive with each step. That's when I stumbled upon an old makeshift altar tucked away behind the trees, adorned with a grotesque collection of animal bones and what looked like dried flowers, and I froze, dread coiling in my stomach as a realization dawned upon me that this wasn't just an innocent surprise. Brad's sense of adventure had led us into something dark and ancient, perhaps a ritual of some sort that beckoned us into its fold. When I nervously voiced my unease, Brad just chuckled and insisted it was all just part of the fun. In his mind, it was another wacky challenge to conquer. That night was a canvas waiting for our adventures to color it, but I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching us, a presence that made my skin crawl, and when I looked back to him, I no longer recognized my boyfriend. The glint in his eyes was wild, as if the forest itself had wrapped him in its cruel grasp. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but he laughed again, telling me I was being dramatic, and pulled my arm, the grip tightening until I yanked away, the laughter fading to an intensity that made my blood run cold. It hit me then that the woods weren't just alive, but they had a heartbeat and it wasn't friendly. "This isn't funny, Brad." I almost screamed as panic bubbled in my chest, but he could barely contain himself, entwining a lock of my hair around his fingers, looking past me as if I were an obstacle blocking him from the greater thrill lurking in the shadows. The air thickened, charged with a tension I couldn't shake and screaming at me to run, but for some reason, I didn't. I felt like I was watching my own life play out in front of me, a puppet on strings I couldn't control. Brad leaned in, whispering something I could no longer hear, his breath brushing against my neck in a way that sent electric shivers down my spine, and then it happened. Behind him, from the darkness, emerged something human-shaped, its limbs crooked and elongated, lurking with a predatory stillness as if it were mimicking the worst parts of humanity. Its gaze locked onto me, pinning me in place, and I fought with every fiber of my being not to scream. It was a body, I realized, a sick parody of a human form, its skin taut and pale as if stretched over too many bones, and I could almost see it smile, formed not from joy but something more sinister, something avid and hungry. I stumbled backward, my survival instincts kicking in, and without a second thought, I bolted back toward the cabin, half glancing over my shoulder to witness the horror unfold as Brad turned, his look of excitement morphing into confusion, then anger as he called out after me, a distorted echo against the trees. I flung myself into the cabin, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding in rhythm from my panic as I frantically locked it, breathing heavy as I sank to the floor, the oppressive quiet of the retreating woods wrapping around me. But it didn't take long before I could hear him pounding on the door, his voice shifting to an angry holler as he demanded I let him in, that I was overreacting, that it was all just part of the surprise. I wanted to scream back, to explain that something had changed in him, that whatever he had become was a stranger, but the dread pulled deeper, shoving all logic aside as I crouched between the couch and a coffee table, praying the darkness would hold me tight. The house felt like a coffin, the night seeped through the walls, mocking my isolation as I reached for my phone, just wanting to call someone, anyone, but when I turned it on, it was dead, an unexpected betrayal that froze the blood in my veins. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear, and the silence that loomed outside felt thicker, a presence lingering just out of sight, and when I finally mustered the courage to peer through the window, my breath caught in my throat. Brad stood looking towards me, uncharacteristically still, shadowed by the trees, but in that moment, the woods seemed to breathe with him, the upside-down grin plastered on his face wider than before. I realized then that whatever he had confronted out there, whatever darkness he had engaged with, had seeped into his very essence, reshaping him into something unrecognizable, and all at once, fear surged. He would come back to the door, but it wouldn't be Brad. I felt it deep in my bones that I had wandered into something that wouldn't allow me to leave easily. My heart raced as shadows danced behind him, flashes of twisted figures lurking in the moonlight, and time seemed to lose sense as the night wore on, every call and pound on the door drowning in an abyss that threatened to devour me whole, and I knew then that the hardest choice lay before me, to wait in agonizing uncertainty or to escape while I still could, but the truth gnawed at me. The person I fell in love with might already be gone, replaced by a reflection of an ancient ritual's hunger, festering beneath the guise I once trusted. Ultimately, I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my bag and slipped out through the back, terrified but driven by the primal instinct to survive, running into the woods with my heart racing, the weight of the foreboding night chasing me as I looked back just once, only to see Brad, the distorted figure in the darkness, staring back, the woods swelling around him, wrapping him in their embrace, and in that haunting moment, I knew I wasn't just running from him, I was escaping an entity that had taken his place, a dark truth that clung to me like an omen, whispering that if I ever looked back, I might join him, too. I never thought my wedding would end in chaos, but when my cousin Lisa showed up in a blood-red gown that clashed with the white theme of my ceremony, it felt like I'd walked into a horror movie instead of my dream day. I had been preparing for this moment for months, pouring my heart and soul into every detail, from the flowers to the music, all meticulously designed to evoke the purest enchantment, while I floated down the aisle in the lace gown I had envisioned since childhood, the embodiment of everything I had ever wanted. I remember the moment I spotted Lisa, standing smugly in the doorway of the venue with that gaudy dress that mirrored the sinister beauty of a vampire in some cheap film. I felt the air chill around me, my stomach twisting with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Didn't she know this day wasn't about her? The whispers of my friends buzzed in my ears, murmurs of disdain that fed my fury as I approached her, my carefully cultivated smile now plastered on my face like a mask. "Lisa, why are you here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, knowing the photographer was capturing every moment. "I thought it'd be a nice surprise," she replied, her tone dripping with faux innocence. At that moment, I remembered every family gathering where Lisa had overshadowed me, every snide comment she had made that belittled my choices, and I resolved that today would be different. My heart raced as I glanced back at my fiancé, who had excused himself to handle a family emergency but had assured me moments before that he couldn't wait to see me in my dress. Deep down, I didn't want to cause a scene, but her presence felt threatening, malignant, like she was festering in the happy blooms of this day, ready to checkmate me. As I took a step closer, Lisa's eyes flashed with that familiar defiance that prickled the nape of my neck. "What's your issue?" "It's just a color," she responded, feigning ignorance, but the challenge in her voice stoked the fire brewing inside me. "It's not just a color, it's a wedding." I shot back, my fury bubbling to the surface as I wrestled with the decision weighing on my conscience. A part of me was screaming to turn back, to let it slide and just enjoy the day, but another part clung to the bubbling rage, a sense of justice that demanded action. "Leave. Now," I spat, my fingers trembling as I clenched them into fists. The guests' eyes locked onto us, an audience drawn into an unfolding drama that felt vividly alive as whispers rippled through the crowd, but rather than fear, I felt a surge of adrenaline at reclaiming my day, my moment. Lisa's facade cracked, anger bubbling up beneath her flawless skin as she opened her mouth to retort, but all I could think about was how tired I was of being walked over, tired of being the unobtrusive cousin, the forever witness to her eclipses, tired of everything that had been unsaid over the years. "You're making a mistake. This is ridiculous. You're ruining your own wedding. Over something so petty," she shouted, her voice cutting through the whispers, drawing me closer to confrontation. I could see the shock on the faces of a few of my aunts, the mixture of gasps and raised eyebrows filling the room with anticipation, but I had crossed the threshold, I couldn't stop now. With every ounce of resolve I could muster, I turned my back on her, striding toward the wedding coordinator, whose eyes widened in disbelief and then mirrored my determination. "Security, please," I commanded, my heart drumming like a war cry as I heard Lisa hiss behind me, the noise echoing with the venom of a snake cornered, but I pressed on. I knew what having her there meant. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about the years of her putting me in the shadows. Moments later, two burly men approached, their expressions neutral yet ready, and when they were instructed to escort Lisa out, the look of hurt and fury painted her face as she went limp, her shock overwhelming her defiance. "You'll regret this," she spat as she was guided out, each word a dart aimed at my heart. As I stood there, shaking but finally feeling light, the burden of her specter lifted from my shoulders, the weight of my family's toxicity unfurling in the dust behind her. The ceremony resumed, but I could feel the eyes of my relatives boring into my back, the murmurs of disapproval hanging in the air thick as fog, and I couldn't tell if they were aggrieved by my actions or secretly relieved to be rid of the drama Lisa seemed to constantly bring. My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. The moment of triumph had morphed into a shadow of regret, the whispers of bridezilla and family tension stirring uncontrollably around me like a whirlwind of judgmental stares. As the vows were exchanged and I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wouldn't take this lightly, especially with her threatening words hanging heavy in the air. After the ceremony, as the reception blossomed around me in joyful chaos, laughter, dancing, and so many smiles, my joy felt marred by the creeping shadow of guilt. Could I really celebrate a day that, in some way, felt marred by the act of banishment? I tried to brush away the thoughts, focusing instead on the love swelling in my chest for my husband and the genuine moments shared with our friends, but Lisa's presence loomed heavily in my mind like a specter waiting to strike. Days turned into weeks, and just as I thought I could forget about the wedding drama, my phone buzzed late one night, draining the color from my face. It was a group text from my family. My heart raced as I opened it to find a picture of Lisa in that hideous, blood-red gown, with the caption, "Some weddings should be cancelled." My stomach dropped like a stone as her slander spread through our family like wildfire. The rising tide of animosity was making its way toward me, wrapping around my throat, threatening to suffocate the joy I had fought for. Each Sunday dinner became an arena of cold silence, excluding me from family conversations as I was framed as the villain, and while I was initially defensive, the weight of isolation left me gasping. The day finally came when I was invited to a family gathering with an air of dread. As I stepped through the front door, I could practically feel the judgment dripping from the ceiling fixtures. I quietly made my way to the living room, my heart thundering loudly against my ribcage as I caught sight of Lisa, clad in white this time, sitting smugly at the center of the table like some dark queen surveying her territory. The tension gripped me like an iron fist, clenching my heart as unwelcome memories spiraled back. Her smirk twisted with cruelty was overwhelming, laying bare the extent of her hunger for vengeance. I stood frozen in place, contemplating my next move when Lisa's eyes met mine with a glint of sadistic glee, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "Oh look, the bride graces us with her presence. Didn't you know weddings are supposed to be about everyone?" she quipped, laughter bubbling around her like a toxic potion, and just like that, the room shifted, murmurs erupting anew as I felt their eyes darting with interest between us. Her words were daggers, driving my insecurities deeper, igniting an inferno of rage within me, but instead of striking back as I longed to, all I could muster was a weak smile. "I'm glad to see you, too, Lisa," I managed to reply, forcing the words to escape, every syllable leaving a bitter taste in my mouth while her laughter washed over me like a tide, depending on the whispers of my family to feed her power. As the evening wore on, I noticed that my cousin didn't relent, sowing discord with poisoned words, planting unease in the hearts of my loved ones that grew more potent with every sip of wine. When I left that night, I felt the confines of my own family closing in, shadows whispering ever so softly, was I really the villain? But the truth was, standing at the edge of that wedding day, I had fought for myself in a world that always sidelined me, and even if the consequences were grave, I couldn't say I didn't deserve my moment of victory, however fleeting. So, AITA for having my cousin thrown out of my wedding? I don't know yet, but as I drive away, the question trembles in my mind: what kind of family comes together by building their foundation on the bones of betrayal? I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine, something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house, my heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer, my curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the two boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore, their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, two tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision, I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer, "Ida for not giving the neighbors' kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse, my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me. I've never thought I'd question my own sanity, but last summer changed everything. It all started when my best friend, Sarah, announced her engagement. Sarah was someone I grew up with, and we've shared everything from childhood secrets to adult heartbreaks, so when she asked me to be her maid of honor, I felt honored but terrified. The wedding was grand, extravagant by every measure, and I wanted everything to be perfect for her. That's when the dress came into the picture. The moment I saw it, I felt my stomach tighten. The floor-length silk gown was beautiful, but the plunging neckline and sheer sides left little to the imagination. For someone like me, who never felt comfortable in the spotlight, it was a nightmare. As if sensing my hesitation, Sarah insisted I look like a hot bridesmaid because the dress is meant to show off our beauty. I felt like a prop rather than a person, a mere decoration for Sarah's fairy tale, and as I stared at the dress hanging in my closet, I realized I couldn't bring myself to wear it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands, literally, sneaking some fabric from a craft store to alter the dress a bit. Nothing drastic, just enough to cover my shoulders and up the neckline slightly. I felt guilty but convinced myself that it was okay since I was still honoring the essence of the dress but adapting it to my own comfort. The night before the wedding, I stayed up late, stitching away, feeling proud of myself until dread settled in. What if Sarah saw it? Would she flip? I told myself that all would be fine, that this was just for me, for my confidence, but as I slipped into that gown the next day, I felt a chill run down my spine like I was about to walk into a lion's den. The venue was filled with laughter and shimmering lights, and the moment I stepped through the entrance, I could feel all eyes on me. But instead of ridicule or judgment, I saw nods of approval, murmured compliments about how elegant I looked. It was euphoric until I spotted Sarah, who stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief, her mouth moving but the words lost in the frantic music around us. Before I could process her reaction, she stormed over to me, seething. "Did you alter my dress?" she asked through gritted teeth, her voice devoid of warmth. I stammered, trying to explain how it was too revealing for my taste, but her expression hardened further. "You weren't supposed to change anything, this is my wedding." I felt the temperature in the room drop, and it became painfully clear that her dream of perfect bridesmaids and perfection had been shattered by someone who dared to adapt their own version of beauty. As she dragged me outside, the laughter from the party faded into a distant echo, and it felt like I was about to be sentenced. "You made a mockery of me," she whispered fiercely. A part of me wanted to yell back, to explain that it was about comfort, not mockery, but all of the words seemed trapped in my throat. Before I could speak, she turned and raced back inside, leaving me outside, alone amidst the fading light. The next hour was a whirlwind of chaotic emotions. It disrupted the flow of the wedding entirely, while I stood there, shaking, feeling like a pariah. Guests started casting sideways glances in my direction, some whispering, while others just outright stared. That's when the uncertainty morphed into something darker. I knew I had crossed a line. The coldness from Sarah seeped deeper inside me as I replayed our confrontation and my own insecurity that led to this moment. Was I really the villain in this story? Or was I merely trying to reclaim a piece of my one fading sense of self at the expense of someone else's happiness? After the ceremony, I retreated to the bathroom, convinced I needed to gather my thoughts, but as I approached the mirror, I noticed something uncanny about my reflection. My altered dress, the fabric I thought was meant to help me, seemed to distort my own likeness in an almost grotesque manner. The neckline I was proud of now began to look jagged and monstrous, the sleeves felt like chains wrapping around me, pulling tighter and tighter. I blinked, and for a fleeting moment, I swore I saw another face, a twisted, smirking mask that looked like me but wasn't. I staggered back, suddenly feeling like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. Shaking my head, I took a breath, reassured myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear crawled deeper into my bones. When I finally left the bathroom, I found the reception room in chaos. Sarah was surrounded by a group of bridesmaids, enraged faces all around her, casting accusatory glances at me like I was the villain in their beloved tale. The apprehension in the air was palpable, every laugh a bit too sharp, every cheer unnaturally loud. Before I could even register what was happening, I heard whispers form into words, accusing me of sabotaging the wedding, of making my insecurities the focus of Sarah's big day, as if I was some attention seeker reveling in the chaos I'd concocted. In those moments, I felt their judgment slice through me like a dagger, and that's when I caught sight of my own reflection in the highly polished plates scattered across the tables. I looked at the corrupted image of myself in the dress, and suddenly it struck me, I wasn't merely altering a dress, I was trying to alter my reality, to fit into a world where I didn't belong, where beauty meant something else entirely, something that warped my very sense of being. The music played on, the chaos intensified, and I felt a desperate urge to escape, to shed the skin of my own creation. I turned and fled while they continued to hurl insults behind me, the laughter losing its warmth, becoming a cruel echo that taunted my every step. That night was a blur, a prison of my own making that left me shaken, haunted by the reflection of what I had become. The next morning, Sarah and I spoke. She never forgave me, claiming I ruined her day, that I should have understood the importance of sacrifices for the sake of friendship. But as we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that my desire to alter that dress, to claim my own narrative, had unleashed something far more sinister. I'd broken a bond not just with her, but with a version of myself who sought acceptance in a world where the beauty seemed so unforgiving, and I became a specter of that night, roaming through my thoughts, knowing in the deepest chambers of my mind that sometimes, you might not just alter a dress, you might alter the very fabric of who you are, and in doing so, you risk losing everything that you held dear. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, Ida for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. When I was 13, my family took me to visit my cousin Chloe, who lived in a small town where rumors wrapped around old houses like thick vines, and where the wind seemed to be a constant whisper of secrets. I adored Chloe. She was always the life of the party, brimming with laughter and confident chatter. But that summer night, everything changed when I ventured into the unfamiliar shadows of her house, seeking the solace of her bedroom, where old posters flaked on the walls and scented candles struggled against the oppressive humid air. Chloe's boyfriend, Tom, was there, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You should really see how easy it is to summon spirits," he said, a spark of something darker glittering in his eyes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, but his words festered, like a nest of wasps in my gut. Later that night, after he shoved a chair beneath the window and claimed to have called the dead by their first names, we gathered around the small table, Tom urging us to play a game, an innocent enough guise, but I could tell he was feeding off my unease. Chloe twirled her hair, oblivious to the dread crawling up my spine, but despite my protests, curiosity clawed at me until I felt I had no choice but to give in. As we joined hands in a circle, Tom began talking to the darkness, inviting any entity to join us, while a chill seeped into the room. A pressure hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the candles flickered wildly and the temperature dropped. I shuddered, desperately wishing for a way out, when a flash of cold wind swept through the eerily still air, and the lights flickered, sending all three of us sprawling in panic against the wall. I thought I saw it, a shadow darting behind Tom, and I swear, for a brief moment, I could feel the breath of something unfathomable on my neck. "Stop it," I shouted, the pitch of my voice breaking. Chloe shot me a hurt look as Tom smirked, clearly reveling in my unease. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than a pawn to be manipulated in his sick game. When I finally pulled away, running down the dimly lit hallway with pounding footsteps, I felt something cold and unyielding grip my heart, like the hand of whatever he had conjured. I stumbled out of the house, frantically kicking stones in the gravel driveway, determined to put distance between me and Tom's sinister antics. As I walked away, I lost track of time, my senses overwhelmed by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant murmur of wind slipping between the trees. I thought, foolishly, that I could shake the feeling of dread, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt I had made a mistake. By leaving, I had done something wrong. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind me, and I turned to see the front door swing open, Chloe stumbling out, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you leave?" she wailed, her breath hitching. I could barely form a response, the morbid reality sinking in. Before I could say anything, she yelled, "You made him angry." Confusion overwhelmed me as she explained how Tom had followed me, his demeanor shifting from smug to furious in seconds. I wanted to retreat into my own thoughts but couldn't. Her anguish was palpable, igniting guilt for a decision I'd made. "You shouldn't have played that game," she cried, her body trembling. Moments later, Tom stepped out onto the porch, his expression morphing eerily from anger to something chillingly vacant. "This is all your fault," he said, voice eerily devoid of emotion, before he slammed the door shut. It felt surreal, like being trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality began to fray at the edges. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance melded with Chloe's sobs. I attempted to comfort her, but it didn't help. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. What happened next is a blur. A strange stillness settled in the air, wrapping around us as if the universe itself paused to hold its breath. Chloe's phone buzzed violently, and she snatched it up, eyes widening. "It's Tom," she whispered, trembling. The heavy air thickened as she pressed the phone to her ear. I stood frozen, the world blurring around me as I listened to her end of the conversation. "No. Please, Tom. Don't say that," she begged, her voice breaking. When she finally hung up, her face was drained of color, a ghostly pallor that terrified me. "He's done," she whispered hollowly, and for the first time, I felt fear gripping not only for her but for what lurked just beyond the threshold of normalcy. It turned out that every time I left a room, every time I faltered, it incited a violent reaction in Tom. The shadows had answered his desperation. He wasn't just losing Chloe, he was losing himself, and in that moment, it felt like a dark loop had eclipsed our lives. I felt as if I had stumbled into a living horror story, where the protagonist's decision to run away from danger only served to amplify the horror for those left behind. Days turned into months, and Chloe would later describe that night as the beginning of the end. She could still hear him speaking in tongues, lost in the dark magic of old stories he shouldn't have touched, and somehow I felt responsible. It wasn't a clear-cut evil, no one died that night, but in her eyes, I could see the shadow crawl deeper, and I knew I had done something irrevocable. My heart ached with the weight of knowing that every sob escaping her lips felt like a piece of the blame sinking into my chest. Each encounter felt haunted, and every family gathering turned sour. The laughter morphed into daggers each time I saw Tom in the corner, wearing an expression of abandonment. He unleashed chaos in a white-hot rage, and soon after, their relationship crumbled, but the repercussions reverberated through Chloe's life like thunder. Was I really an asshole for leaving, or was it merely a breath before the descent into madness? It's hard to differentiate what's tangible and what's not when you're marking the boundaries of your sanity. While we navigate the dim corridors of our past longing for the light, sometimes the door you think leads to the safety of the outside world becomes the very breach through which darkness floods in, and the shadows inside you will haunt you long after you think you've escaped. I still wonder whether the real spirits were the stories we buried, too terrified to admit that they lived not only in the shadows of the night but eternally within us. I never thought I would reach a point where I had to make a post like this, but here I am, desperate for validation on whether I'm the asshole in this twisted situation. It all started last spring when my brother, Mark, began showing up unannounced at my apartment. At first, I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd drop in with some lame excuse about needing to borrow a tool or ask for advice on his car, but as weeks passed, his visits morphed from casual to obsessive. It wasn't long before I noticed things started to feel off. He'd expertly manipulate the conversation to shift focus to my life, probing about my job, my friendships, my love life, as if gathering data to fuel some hidden agenda. I brushed it off as sibling curiosity at first, shrugging it away until that one fateful afternoon I came home from work to find my door wide open. Panic washed over me as I rushed inside, heart racing, to find my apartment completely intact. But there, in the living room, was a note rested on my coffee table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You need to be more open to me." It unnerved me more than I could express. Was I being paranoid? I decided to confront him, and when I did, Mark laughed it off, insisting I was reading too much into it. But I was no longer comfortable with him just popping by whenever he felt like it. I needed my space. So, after much deliberation, I made the decision to change the locks. When I told him, he looked at me, the laughter draining from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. He said nothing but walked away, a shadow crossing his features. A week later, I woke up in the dead of night to the distinct sound of my door jiggling. My heart pounded as I froze in fear, listening carefully, praying it was just an old pipe or a figment of my imagination. But no, the rattling persisted for what felt like hours, and then it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for the right moment to breach my sanctuary. I buried myself in my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. Mark was relentless. The next morning, I found more notes scattered around my apartment, all manner of things from "I just want to help" to "Why can't you see I'm your only family?" It was suffocating, the pervasive sense of dread that began to chase me through my days. I felt trapped in a nightmare, and the lines of love and manipulation blurred until there was nothing left but darkness. I decided to take action. I went to the police station and filed a report. They couldn't do much, just a recognized nuisance, they said. As I left, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to protect me. Every break in my routine, every sound outside my window incited pure terror. I looked for any chance to escape, weekend getaways, late-night shifts, anything to avoid the haunting presence of my brother. And then one stormy evening, with thunder rumbling and rain pouring like the sky itself was breaking apart, someone banged on my window. It was Mark, drenched and grinning in a way that set off alarm bells in my mind. "Surprise. I thought I'd come over to help you with that article you're working on." The sickening jolt of dread coursed through my veins. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I quickly mumbled something and darted to the door, locking it just as he reached for the handle. But I could see him through the peephole, my own brother. His grin widened, but his eyes were wild, icicles of twisted madness in the torrential downpour. With every thump of his fist against the door, the world outside blurred, leaving only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I was losing my grip, feeling as if I was slipping into some alternate reality. Was I the villain for wanting space? Was it wrong to feel caged by someone who claimed to love me, or was I just pushing him away? I yelled at him to leave, realizing too late the trap I had walked into, his soft chuckle echoing unnervingly through the night. "But I'm your family. We're supposed to be close." I finally lost it, my voice cracking as I screamed, "Aren't you supposed to care about what I want?" And just like that, the laughter stopped. Mark's expression shifted, his mouth tightened as he said, "You think you can change the locks on family? You can't escape me." I bolted to my bedroom, fumbling for my phone, but as I turned, I saw him standing in my living room, having somehow slipped through a window I thought I had locked. My breath caught in my throat as he said very calmly, "It's not just the lock settling the score, sis. You need to learn that family always finds a way in." Then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, I was sprawled on the floor of my apartment with no memory of what happened next, but one thing was clear: in that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in a family tied tighter than the strongest chain, each link weighed down with the burden of madness. My brother was no longer just a sibling, he had become something beyond that, something dangerous, twisted. Now, as I sit here, typing this, I can't help but wonder if I did the right thing by confronting him, changing the locks, and asking him to stay away. But the truth is, I still hear his laughter echoing through the walls, and that little voice keeps haunting me. Ida for telling my brother to stop coming unannounced? I think I might be the biggest fool for thinking I could change the locks on the chains binding us. Thanksgiving had always been a family affair in my house, but this year felt different. This year, my husband eagerly announced his friend might be bringing her dog to dinner. Her dog, a strange hybrid mix of some kind of terrier and things I couldn't even identify, had a penchant for mischief, and as someone who had witnessed the aftermath of its chaotic visits in the past, I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. From the moment I said no to the canine inclusion, an unseen tension crackled through the air like static electricity, my husband's face darkened, and a silenced argument bubbled beneath the surface. "It's just a dog," he'd insisted, but I couldn't shake the memories of Thanksgivings past where that little beast had devoured half of my cousin's pie and shredded a pillow beyond recognition while the adults were too distracted by football to notice. Besides, there was something unsettlingly unnatural about how that dog would stare at me from the corner of the room, its dark eyes boring into my soul, as though it were waiting, watching, plotting. In the days leading up to the dinner, I was met with accusations of being a dog-phobe, and while I had nothing against dogs in general, there was something profoundly off about this one. When Thanksgiving Day finally arrived, I found myself setting the table with a sense of dread, the silence of my reluctance hanging thick in the air. As my husband and his friend arrived, I noticed she wore this bizarre, almost victorious grin, as if the anticipation of chaos fueled her swagger. "You didn't really think she would have to leave her dog behind, did you?" She chuckled, throwing me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The door swung open, and Toby, a name the dog bizarrely longed for, pranced into the house, his small body wiggling eagerly. I felt a knot form in my stomach as it darted around, sniffing everything, as if cataloging my life's most precious belongings. Dinner progressed amid the usual laughter and chatter, but I couldn't focus, my unease festered like a wound. That dog, now settled like a predator on a distant rack of bones, would occasionally fix me with its unsettling gaze, and each time I caught it watching me, the atmosphere warped around us. I started hearing whispers in the shadows, hushed tones that sent an ice-cold tremor through my bones, as if conversations were happening just out of sight, echoing thoughts that were never spoken aloud. The friendly barking morphed into something darker as the hours rolled on, and laughter turned hollow, every cheerful exchange gouging deeper into my consciousness, replacing comfort with creeping dread. At one point, while serving turkey, I looked up only to see Toby at my feet, staring, his pupils dilated to a menacing sliver. In that very moment, the power flickered, plunging us into darkness before the lights stubbornly returned, and suddenly it wasn't just the dog watching me, it felt as if something else lurked beneath the surface, hidden yet glaring. My eyes skimmed across the room, grasping for a shred of normalcy, only to lock onto Toby, who now seemed frozen, his body tense, poised as if preparing for something unspeakable. I forced a laugh when my husband and his friend joined me, but everything felt warped, strange, unsettling, a distortion of reality wrapped in familial love. When the dessert arrived, I felt the vibration of panic crawl through my fingertips as I skimmed across the table. I had baked a pumpkin pie my grandmother used to make. Just as I placed the pie down, Toby darted forward like a sprinter at the starting gun, sending the beautiful piece of pie flying to the ground, shattered into an unrecognizable mess. Everyone gasped, laughter dissolving into disbelief as my husband yelled, "Toby, no!" My pulse quickened, and in that instant of chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a silent signal that something was horribly wrong. The dog wasn't just clumsy, he was deliberate, and I desperately shouted, "Get that thing outside!" Something in my voice snapped through the tension, and as Toby was whisked away, I turned to see my husband's friend buckle in response. The joy she'd entered with had morphed into something closer to rage. "What's wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice suddenly low, laced with venom. The rest of the night was a blur of hurried movements and strained silences, the air humid with unspoken tension, until I finally noticed the flickering lights again, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew, now harsh and chaotic, mocking me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were trapped in some cruel play, and that little dog, no, that creature, was pulling the strings. Just as I thought the worst was over, the front door swung open, and I caught sight of Toby again, alone, sitting eerily still on the porch, head cocked at an angle, as if he had a message to deliver. My blood ran cold, an instinctual fear curling within me, and the room fell silent as everyone turned. "Where's your friend?" I choked out, my voice trembling. Just then, the atmosphere shifted, a cloud of apprehension flooded over us, washing away any last ounce of warmth. I glanced at my husband, only to see his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "She's got to be joking, right? She didn't go out there, did she?" he gasped, his mind racing. Time seemed to slow down. I had unintentionally opened a door to something dark and unfathomable, and as panic mounted, I braced myself in silence, a haunting thought spiraling within my mind. What had come into our lives alongside Toby? I kept searching for my husband's friend, but it felt as if she had vanished into the ether, a specter hidden among shadows. My heart raced wildly, the whispers louder now, seemingly orchestrating my descent into dread. I gathered the courage to open the front door, and what I saw snuffed the last flickers of hope from my mind. There, on the porch, was Toby, but the dog wore a face unmistakably adorned with blood, brighter than the crimson hues of falling leaves. What happened next unraveled everything. The shadows conspired, my husband stepped out, and in that instant, the world twisted, the line between human and beast blurred. I stood frozen as a deafening howl pierced the night. The laughter of my family became grotesque, mocking me, pulling me deeper into the oblivion. Ida. My once warm Thanksgiving dinner dissolved into echoes of despair, leaving me to wonder if my simple refusal had unleashed something far darker that lay nestled in the shadows, forever altering our lives, forever horror-drenching my innocent hopes. I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag. What I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strained sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood, in that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut?